20 doctors circled the billionaire's hospital bed, their brilliance dimmed by confusion, their million-dollar machines blinking uselessly as his life ebbed away second by second. They had ruled out strokes, heart attacks, infections, and every rare genetic disorder they knew. But still the man's breathing rattled and his skin turned a terrifying shade of gray. Nurses rushed, alarms screamed, and specialists whispered. But the richest man in the city was dying, and no one could stop it. Then, from the corner of the room, a voice that no one expected broke through the chaos. It wasn't a professor from Harvard or a surgeon from Johns Hopkins. It was the black housekeeper, the quiet woman who had dusted his mansion for years, who saw what they had missed. And once she spoke, the entire room froze, because what she revealed didn't just explain his mysterious illness. It exposed a secret powerful enough to destroy everything he had built. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe right now, because this story will keep twisting until the very last word, and you don't want to miss a single turn. The billionaire, Victor Holloway, was a man who seemed untouchable, his empire stretching across continents, his name etched on skyscrapers, his private jets carving the sky like silver arrows. Yet now, in the sterile white glare of St. Regis Medical Tower, his fortune meant nothing. Machines beeped at his bedside, tubes coiled around his arms, and the world's top 20 doctors had flown in at obscene cost to rescue him. But none could explain why his heart skipped erratically, why his lungs fought invisible pressure, why his veins seemed poisoned by something unseen. Each doctor added a theory: parasite, undetected tumor, toxin, but their tests contradicted one another. The board of directors waited in panic outside, his children argued over inheritance, and the media swarmed the hospital. But no one noticed Marlene, the housekeeper who had served him silently for 2 decades. Standing quietly in the corner of the ICU, she had folded his shirts, polished his mahogany floors, watched him host political power players and celebrities, and she knew things about his routines, his diet, his moods, and his obsessions that the doctors never asked. As she watched the chaos, her sharp eyes caught the faint stain on his lips, the strange smell of his breath, the tremor in his hand that did not match his medical charts. She remembered something from weeks earlier, something every specialist had overlooked. And though she doubted herself against all these celebrated minds, a knot in her stomach told her the truth was darker than any diagnosis in their textbooks. Marlene's memories began to churn as she stood silently in the hospital room, her calloused hands gripping the edge of her apron, her eyes darting between the billionaire's gray, clammy face and the physicians pacing with tablets and murmured theories. She had been in his mansion long enough to see habits and patterns no one else paid attention to, small details tucked away in the folds of ordinary life that seemed unremarkable then, but now blazed like warning signs in her mind. Victor Holloway was a man obsessed with health, obsessed with immortality in a way only billionaires could afford. His kitchens had been converted into laboratories of exotic powders, imported teas, rare tonics bought from underground markets, jars of bright-colored supplements delivered weekly by couriers who wore gloves and masks as though they carried sacred relics. His chefs and nutritionists had always been under strict orders to mix these concoctions into his meals without question. Marlene, while scrubbing counters or polishing silver, had overheard his murmurs to guests about pushing human limits and living past 100 without a wrinkle, words that sounded like vanity but were underlined by something darker, as though he knew secrets that money could buy but science could not yet reveal. Weeks earlier, she had noticed changes that the family ignored: his sudden irritability when the gardeners left footprints on the marble steps, his cold sweat during morning walks through the rose garden, the strange rashes blooming on his chest and arms that he hid beneath designer shirts, the fatigue that sent him upstairs to bed hours before midnight dinners ended. At the time she thought it was stress, the weight of running empires, but now as she stared at his pale lips and trembling hands, it connected like pieces of a puzzle. This was not an illness born in nature. It was a slow corruption, something seeping into him drop by drop, bite by bite, until it crippled him from within. She remembered one afternoon when she entered the kitchen to deliver laundry and caught a faint whiff of bitter almond rising from a pot of tea, a smell her grandmother once warned her meant danger. But the chef had quickly covered the cup with a lid and brushed past her as if she were invisible. She remembered finding a discarded container in the pantry, its rim crusted with greenish mold, and when she threw it out, the same container appeared again the next day, fresh and sealed, like some ritual she was not meant to question. She remembered Victor's sudden paranoia, how he had installed cameras in every hallway of the mansion, yet trusted the one man closest to his meals without hesitation, never once doubting the loyalty of his personal chef. And above all, she remembered the chilling sight, just a week ago, of that chef sprinkling a pinch of something powdery into Victor's evening drink, his eyes darting to the doorway, unaware she was watching from the shadows as she dusted the chandeliers. Now standing in the hospital with the finest doctors in the world pulling their hair out, she felt a storm rising in her chest because she knew they were chasing ghosts in blood tests and scans, while the real killer walked freely, carrying poison in his pocket like salt, blending it so carefully into Victor's health-obsessed meals that not even the machines could tell the difference. And though fear burned inside her, fear of being dismissed, laughed at, or punished, she knew she could no longer keep silent, for if she stayed quiet, the man she had served faithfully for 2 decades would not live to see another sunrise, and the shadows hiding in his mansion would claim victory without ever being seen.
When Marlene finally broke her silence, the words came out trembling at first, her voice no louder than the beeping of the heart monitor, yet they cut through the heated arguments of the 20 physicians who had crowded around Victor's bed. Men and women with reputations carved in ivory towers, people so accustomed to being the final word that they barely noticed the housekeeper in the corner. But when she said, "Check his food," the room fell momentarily still. Not because they believed her, but because the audacity of such a suggestion from someone in a plain uniform shocked them into silence. A few chuckled under their breath, others shook their heads. One even muttered about nonsense from untrained staff. But desperation is a strange persuader, and after hours of fruitless theories and inconclusive scans, one younger doctor, perhaps more open-minded than the rest, ordered a small sample of Victor's meal trays, his supplements, and the tea still left in a thermos to be sent to the lab, if only to humor the absurdity of it. Marlene stood rooted, her heart hammering, wondering if she had just doomed herself to ridicule. Yet hours later, when the toxicology report returned, the sterile printout ignited a storm. The samples contained trace amounts of aconite, the legendary queen of poisons, an ancient toxin used in assassinations and folklore, capable of mimicking cardiac arrest, nerve failure, and 1,000 other ailments. A poison so deceptive that even the most advanced machines could miss it if no one thought to search for it. The doctors erupted, some horrified, some defensive, all scrambling to cover their disbelief that a housekeeper had seen what they had not. One slammed a tablet on the counter, another cursed under his breath, but in the midst of their commotion, Marlene's eyes locked on the figure of the personal chef who had been waiting near the doorway, his face drained of color, his body trembling, like a guilty child caught in the act. She recognized that look. She had seen it once in her childhood when a neighbor was confronted for stealing from a church donation box. It was the look of a soul exposed. The security detail moved swiftly, gripping his arms before he could vanish, and in that moment the tension in the room shifted from medical mystery to criminal revelation. Under interrogation, the chef cracked quickly, his words spilling like a dam breaking, admitting he had slipped the poison into Victor's food. But the explanation that followed darkened the air more than the confession itself. He claimed he had not acted of his own will, that he had been forced, paid, and threatened by men in tailored suits who came not from dark alleys, but from polished boardrooms. Men who promised fortune if he complied and ruin if he resisted. These men, he stammered, were not strangers. They were Victor's closest allies, partners who stood to gain billions if the billionaire were to die quietly under the guise of a medical mystery. The doctors stared, dumbfounded, their egos bruised. Their trust in science rattled, and Marlene, who had spent 2 decades being invisible, now stood as the only person who had pierced the veil. Yet beneath her relief burned a new terror. For if the chef's confession was true, then Victor's illness was not just the result of a personal betrayal, but the opening move in a vast conspiracy reaching into his empire, his family, and perhaps even the government officials he entertained at his mansion. And in that suffocating room, with sirens wailing outside and cameras beginning to swarm the hospital entrance, Marlene realized she had not just saved a man's life. She had stumbled into a battlefield of power where the shadows were deeper, sharper, and far more dangerous than poison itself. Victor's life was saved by the antidotes, but the revelation of poison set fire to everything he thought he controlled. Investigators followed the chef's trail of payments and discovered accounts linked to his own board members, men who had smiled at his table while plotting his death. Arrests came swiftly, fortunes crumbled overnight, and the empire Victor built was nearly destroyed by those he trusted most. Through it all, Marlene remained steady, refusing money or reward, content only that justice had been served. She returned to her quiet life, though the world now knew her name. The housekeeper who had seen what 20 doctors missed, the woman whose sharp eyes had toppled a conspiracy. For Victor, survival was no longer about power or wealth, but about remembering the one truth Marlene had taught him. Sometimes salvation comes not from the highest towers of knowledge, but from the overlooked soul who simply dares to see what others ignore.